It is clear that the dialectic of sense certainty is nothing else but the simple history of its movement or of its experience. And sense certainty itself is nothing else but just this history. That is why the natural consciousness, too, is always reaching this result, learning from experience what is true in it, but equally it is always forgetting and starting the movement all over again. It is therefore astonishing when, in the face of this experience, it is asserted as universal experience and put forward, too, as a philosophical proposition, even as the outcome of skepticism, that the reality or being of external things taken as this is, or sense objects, has absolute truth for consciousness. To make such an assertion is not to know what one is saying, to be unaware that one is saying the opposite of what one wants to say. The truth for consciousness of a this of sense is supposed to be universal experience, but the very opposite is universal experience. Every consciousness itself supersedes such a truth, as, for example, here is a tree, or now is noon, and proclaims the opposite. Here is not a tree, but a house, and similarly, it immediately again supersedes the assertion which set aside the first so far, as it is also just an assertion of a sensuous this. And what consciousness will learn from experience is in all sense certainty is, in truth, only what we have seen, that is, the this as a universal, the very opposite of what that assertion affirmed to be universal experience. With this appeal to universal experience, we may be permitted to anticipate how the case stands in the practical sphere. In this respect, we can tell those who assert the truth and certainty of the reality of sense objects that they should go back to the most elementary school of wisdom, that is, the ancient Eleusinian mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus, and that they have still to learn the secret meaning of the eating of bread and the drinking of wine. For he that is initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of sensuous things, but to despair of it. In part, he brings about the nothingness of such things himself in his dealings with them, and in part he sees them reduce themselves to nothingness. Even the animals are not shut out from this wisdom, but on the contrary show themselves to be most profoundly initiated into it. For they do not just stand idly in front of sensuous things as if those possessed intrinsic being, but despairing of their reality and completely assured of their nothingness, they fall to without ceremony and eat them up. And all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries which teach the truth about sensuous things. Paragraph 109 is the penultimate part of sense certainty, and it's pretty long. There's a lot going on there, but I think we can divide it into three main things. Hegel is talking about what's going on with the dialectic of sense certainty and how that leads to what's going on for natural consciousness. That's one thing. I don't have on the board what he's talking about in terms of skepticism, and he's not using the term, but essentially empiricism. But we're going to talk about that as well. And then he's got this really fascinating passage about the mysteries, about these Greek mysteries, and the eating of the bread and the drinking of the wine, and what's going on with that. What is its deeper significance? So he says that the dialectic of sense certainty turns out to be the history of its movement or of experience. And so what does that mean? Well, all these passages that we've looked at before in which we've been following along with what happens in sense certainty, that's that dialectic. We have been having the experience, and you might say that, well, that's just an intellectual experience. I've just been watching you, write things on the board or reading Hegel or listening to you lecture. No, if you've actually been doing this the right way, you've been reflecting on, well, what is it like when I experience something, when I think that I have sense experiences about which I can be completely certain. I can take it as I have knowledge, absolute knowledge of that sort of thing. If you've been following along with that, you've seen that there's a lot more involved in this, that it turns out that there's all these relations and mediations and negativity, and we've had some achievements along the way. We've realized what a universal is, at least for Hegel. We've come to understand the importance of the relationship between subject and object. We've realized that now or here or this or even I are universals that apply to particulars. We've also realized or foreshadowed the importance of what it means that there's another I who can perceive, or the fact that I'm an I who consists of a bunch of I's over time, a manifold succession of I's. We've realized that temporality, spatiality are quite complicated. So, we've packed a lot into these paragraphs, haven't we? That's a history. That's a Geschichte, a story. That's an Erfahrung, an experience. We should leave this a little bit different, not just in our intellect, but perhaps in our feelings and our practical comportments. Could be that your feeling is just puzzlement at this point. But we should leave it a little bit different than we entered it. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. So he says, this dialectic of sense certainty that is the history of its movement or experience is actually sense certainty. Sense certainty itself is nothing else but this history. What does that mean? Well, this is where we're going to get to the natural consciousness. Because the sense certainty that he's talking about there is something that we're going through over and over and over again. So Hegel is not just engaging in some sort of abstract musing about what happens when we perceive things and what's involved in that, what does perception include. He's actually talking about a process that before we begin doing philosophy, we've already got a lot of, you might call it work time or experience in with. But we don't realize that we do, in part because one of the things we have to do is move ourselves away from the position of natural consciousness. But natural consciousness is where we begin. So what does natural consciousness do? Natural consciousness, and if you're sort of confused about what he means by natural consciousness, you want to go back to some of the earlier videos from the preface where he was actually talking about that. So he says, natural consciousness is always reaching this result. Learning from experience what is true in it. So natural consciousness has sense certainty. It's engaging with objects. It's locating them at here or there or now or then. And as it's doing that, it starts to realize the truth of sense certainty, which is that things are more complex. And it may do this in a theoretical way, or it may do this in a purely practical, commonsensical way. But it comes to free itself to a certain extent from what we might call the fascination of the particular, being bedazzled by the singular experience that it has. And it realizes that if it wants to try to hold on to those experiences, it actually has to make an effort to do that. This may happen in all sorts of ways. A great example is when we're dealing with pleasant experiences. You eat a piece of chocolate cake. Chocolate is something that is consumed temporally, right? So here we're charting things out in terms of nows. That first bite of cake is probably better than the last bite of cake. It's just the way our olfactory and gustatory faculties work. I'm not sure exactly about the mechanics of this, and I don't need to be. But you get the idea that if you try to hold on to that one single experience, you find yourself more and more, seeing it recede off into the distance, slip out of your grasp, and become something that it's not. Same thing happens when you try to hold on to the pleasure that comes with a massage, or slipping into a hot tub, or laying in the sun. We can't recapture, contrary to what some people believe, lost time. At least not in the sense of going back to and maintaining that present moment. We can do all sorts of dodges. We can try to repeat it over and over, but it's never quite the same, is it? And we can say the same thing for spatiality. I'll give you just an example of this. When I was a kid, I grew up in the countryside in what was at that time a subdivision, but a subdivision that very, very few people had moved into, that it used to be old farmland that was on rolling hills and had been covered up by meadows and quite a few, wooded areas. And it was just wonderful to grow up there as a kid because I could range over miles of territory in very, beautiful settings and, screw around the way that kids do. And there were, a few of us living there at the time, and we did that. And then sooner or later, it all got developed. And when I go back there, I can't have the same experience that I wanted to have. I can't go back to the same place. Why? Because that's the way the world works, You can't hold things constant in time. You can't even hold a space constant either. Now, it's not as if, it's geographically shifted position, but, are all the plants in place? No, they've even cut off the tops of some of the hills, and, that's all changed. So natural consciousness can go through this process and realize this a lot of times. So I can realize the truth of sense certainty. Then something happens. And Hegel describes this in a way that's a little bit puzzling. He says, it's always reaching this result, learning from experience what's true in it, but equally it's always forgetting and starting the movement all over again. Now, he doesn't explain why we go through this forgetting. It could be in part because we haven't sort of dialectically consolidated it for ourselves through some sort of intellectual practice. Could be that, we're just sort of torn away by the cares of a busy life, and we, come back to these cycles over and over again. But natural consciousness, so long as it doesn't learn its lesson and retain that knowledge, isn't going to advance. But it does go through this cycle over and over. So Hegel says, it's therefore astonishing when in the face of this experience that ordinary people can have, the philosophers assert as universal experience that, and assert it as a philosophical proposition, even as the outcome of skepticism, we've got Hume and Kant and people like this in mind, that the reality or being of external things taken as this is, or sense objects, has absolute truth for consciousness. You can say to yourself, I don't know whether that corresponds to something out there real in the world, but I know that I'm having this experience, and I can be totally sure that I'm having this experience and what it is. And if you're an empiricist, then you use those as kind of building blocks. If you read, authors like, say, Locke or Hume, you see that they think that we have these perceptions, and these perceptions give us these basic ideas, and we build up our experience out of them, sort of like a bunch of Legos. Or, with Locke, it's a little bit more like chemical composition. You put together, this element and that element, and you get something else that's interesting instead. So Hegel's saying, no, that's not actually how things work. The reality or being of external things taken as this is or sense objects does not have absolute truth for consciousness. He says, to make such an assertion is not to know what one is saying, or to be unaware that one is saying the opposite of what one wants to say. The truth for consciousness of a this of sense is supposed to be universal experience. So my sense experience, even though it's my sense experience, should be universal experience, which means that whatever it is that I'm sensing, say, we go ahead and we talk about a green ball with a red spot, a la Husserl, I'm imagining that, and I'm also saying that I perceive it. You should be able to do exactly the same thing. You should be able to replicate the thought experiment. Hegel's saying, no, that doesn't actually work like that. To begin with, things are a hell of a lot more complicated in perception than that. And also they're, not absolute. Their absolute status, if they're going to have any, is going to come in a composite whole with other things that arrange them, that put them in order, you might say. So he says, every consciousness itself supersedes this kind of truth. We've just seen that. Here is a tree, or now is noon. And it proclaims the opposite. Here is not a tree, but a house. And what consciousness is going to learn from experience is only what we've seen, the this as a universal, or the very opposite of what that assertion affirmed to be the universal experience. So it's not the sensations or the sense data or the sense perceptions that are really the truth and the thing that matters in sense certainty. It's the universals that we use to make sense of them. And these aren't just sort of categories of the understanding that give us pure concepts that we then apply to experience. No, these are actually linguistic. These are actually, to a certain degree, as we're going to see later on, social. They're a lot closer to us. When I this is going to be a little digression. When I read Kant, I enjoy reading Kant, but I feel like that I that he's describing, who's doing all that, projecting categories and conceptions and, having sense experience, so different from me, so distant from what it is that I actually experience, that it's kind of hard to see it as anything other than kind of a playing around with stuff. Perhaps that's just me. With Hegel, I can actually say, yeah, I can relate to this a lot better. To go on to the third thing, he talks about these mysteries as being a symbol. Now, I don't want people, to start saying, oh, yeah, I knew it, Hegel's a New Ager, or anything like that. He doesn't have anything like that in mind. He says, with this appeal to universal experience, we may be permitted to anticipate how the case stands in the practical sphere. So what is it in our actions that reveals to us how we actually ought to treat things of sense perception? He says, we can tell those who assert the truth and certainty of the reality of sense objects that they should go back to the most elementary school of wisdom, the ancient Eleusinian mysteries of Sirius and Bacchus. I always have trouble pronouncing that word, which is strange because I usually don't have any trouble with the other things in Greek. And that they have to learn the secret meaning of the eating of bread and drinking of wine. Now, is he saying that you need to go to Mass where they eat bread and drink wine? Is he saying that you need to go find yourself someplace in ancient Greece or in modern day Greece where they're going to practice these, find some neo-pagans to do this, or maybe do it yourself in your basement or your study? No, he's not saying that. He's saying just think about what's actually meant by these mysteries. When we're talking about a mystery, we're talking about something that's not actually supposed to remain mysterious for those who are initiated in the mysteries. There's supposed to be some sort of meaning, some sort of deeper understanding that's being afforded, which can be articulated. And the deeper meaning is that when it comes to sensible things, we should doubt their being. Now, it's interesting because the word here for doubt, and this is something a lot of commentators have picked up on, is Zweifeln. And, in German, Zwei is two, Zweifeln, doubt. There's a connection between splitting and, having two possibilities. It really does fit here, though, because what happens when we're going through this whole dialectic? We see that things actually split into two, that there's a relation between the self and the other, that things are mediated through each other. So to doubt is to say maybe there's more going on here. To doubt the being of them doesn't mean I don't think they exist at all, but it's rather to say I doubt whether they have genuine being. I doubt whether the bread really is what it purports to be. I doubt that the wine is really absolute being. So in a certain sense, it's the opposite Hegel's talking about here of what, say, Christians who believe in the Eucharist or the mystery, however you want to translate the term, where the bread and the wine somehow become God. Hegel's not saying that. He's saying the opposite of it. He's saying the bread and the wine are really empty. They become mere symbols. And what do we do? Now, the reason I put a hyphen here is because Hegel is talking about Nichtigkeit. He's not saying nichts. It's a nothingness, a condition of being nothing. And we contribute that to these sensible things. He says, the one who's initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of them, but to despair of it. What does it mean to despair of it? In part, he brings about the nothingness of such things himself in his dealings with them. We're going to see what that means in just a second. But the human being is contributing a nothingness to those beings. He says, in part he sees them reduce themselves to nothingness. He sees them for what they truly are. He sees the truth of their limited being. That they really devolve into nothingness. If not being nothing, being pretty close to it. And here's where it gets kind of funny. You notice I just put here, eat them up. Well, why did I put that? Because Hegel says that's what animals are smart enough to do. You know, put bread in front of a dog. The dog is not going to say, what should I make of this bread? The dog just gobbles it up. Why? Because the bread doesn't really matter in certain respects. The bread matters insofar as it can give the dog calories and the dog likes the taste and all that. But it doesn't have any being that has to be respected. You're not going to take, you won't find a dog, at least, you know, taking a piece of bread and putting it up on some sort of, you know, altar and saying, oh, we must preserve this forever and ever and ever. No, the dog just eats it up. And most human beings will eat up bread too. So he says, even the animals are not shut out from this wisdom. They show themselves to be most profoundly initiated into it. Does that mean that the dogs are part of the Eleusinian mysteries? No. It means that they're doing this by their nature. They don't stand idly in front of sensuous things as if they possessed intrinsic being, as if they actually had value or perdurance in and of themselves. But despairing of their reality and completely assured of their nothingness, they fall to and eat them up. They just gobble them down. And he says, all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries, which teach us about sensuous things. He's not saying that sensuous things don't matter, that they don't have any value, but the value that they have is rather limited. So, you know, what does that mean as far as our quest for absolute knowledge? We're not going to find it here. But, just as our previous remarks would suggest, those who put forward such an assertion also themselves say the direct opposite of what they mean, a phenomenon which is perhaps best calculated to induce them to reflect on the nature of sense certainty. They speak of the existence of external objects, which can be more precisely defined as actual, absolutely singular, wholly personal, individual things, each of them absolutely unlike anything else. This existence, they say, has absolute certainty and truth. They mean this bit of paper on which I am writing, or rather have written this. But what they mean is not what they say. If they actually wanted to say this bit of paper, which they mean, if they wanted to say it, then this is impossible, because the sensuous this that is meant cannot be reached by language, which belongs to consciousness, that is, to that which is inherently universal. In the actual attempt to say it, it would therefore crumble away. Those who started to describe it would not be able to complete the description, but would be compelled to leave it to others, who would themselves finally have to admit to speaking about something which is not. They certainly mean, then, this bit of paper here, which is quite different from the bit mentioned above. But they say actual things, external or sensuous objects, absolutely singular entities, and so on. That is, they say of them only what is universal. Consequently, what is called the unutterable is nothing else than the untrue, the irrational, what is merely meant, but what is not actually expressed. If nothing more is said of something than that it is an actual thing, an external object, its description is only the most abstract of generalities and in fact expresses its sameness with everything rather than its distinctiveness. When I say a single thing, I am really saying what it is from a wholly universal point of view, for everything is a single thing, and likewise, this thing is anything you like. If we describe it more exactly as this bit of paper, then each and every bit of paper is this bit of paper, and I have only uttered the universal all the time. But if I want to help out language, which has the divine nature of directly reversing the meaning of what is said, of making it into something else, and thus not letting what is meant get into words at all, by pointing out this bit of paper, experience teaches me what the truth of sense certainty in fact is. I point it out as a here, which is a here of other heres, or is in its own self a simple togetherness of many heres, that is it is a universal. I take it up then as it is in truth, and instead of knowing something immediate, I take the truth of it, or perceive it. We've finally reached the end of the section on sense certainty, our very first section in the phenomenology proper. And what we're going to do now is make the transition into the next section, which is on perception, still in the frame of consciousness. And Hegel is going to bring about a transition to that. At the very end of this section, we'll talk about the play on words that's involved there in just a moment. But he's going back to this notion of sense certainty and the kind of ideas underlying it that are appealed to by empiricist philosophy as not really what it had purported to be, and as having shown us a different kind of truth, something else that's going on within it. So he says that some people speak of the existence of external objects, and they define these, more precisely as actual, absolutely singular, wholly personal individual beings, and they say each of them is absolutely unlike anything else. So we have these just raw, basic particulars that then we take in through our sense perception, and we begin to, associate them through ideas, and, we may even have stuff like this going on over here with the universals that we form, through language, through consciousness. But those are usually just sort of an assemblage, like a composite picture of these things, or we take one of them to stand in for the other. And that's really, the empiricist theory of perception and abstraction going on there. Now, Hegel says that really doesn't work, and people who talk like that aren't completely thinking through what it is that they're saying. Why? He says they think that existence has absolute certainty and truth, but it doesn't. Why not? Well, let's take an example. This paper. And now we can do a couple different playing around with this. Hegel is actually talking about the piece of paper that he's writing in his manuscript. So we don't have that in front of us as a prop that we could use. But let's just pretend that this book right here, is this paper, this sheet of paper that he's writing on, and we've got sort of an invisible Hegel that as long as while we're reading, he's writing, right? So if they mean this bit of paper on which I'm writing, or rather have written this, but what they mean is not what they say. If they actually wanted to say this bit of paper, which they mean, if they wanted to say it, to express it, that's impossible. Well, why is that the case? Well, because, singularity or sort of a personal, totally, surd identity is not susceptible to being framed within language. We've already talked about this before. The I can't reserve the I just for me, or it turns into a crazy nonsense word that doesn't mean anything. Or I suppose a proper name. But even proper names are, in a certain way, universal insofar as they're proper names. So there's kind of a dividing line between what would be over on this side and be totally universal, or totally singular, totally actual, and then the abstractions in our head, the language that we speak. So if we want to talk about this piece of paper, we can talk about this little piece of paper here, but that piece of paper quickly becomes just a bunch of linguistic signs or a bunch of conceptions that we have. So he says, this sensuous this that is meant cannot be reached by language. That belongs to consciousness, to what is inherently universal. So in calling it paper, I'm already associating it with all the conceptions that I have of paper, with the universal of paper, with the word paper, with the consciousness that I have, the thought of paper. And I lose sight of this actual thing in front of me. Okay, the empiricist might say, so what? So he says, those who started to describe it would not be able to complete the description. As soon as you try to describe something, to say, well, what is it about that piece of paper? Imagine if Hegel were doing that. Well, that manuscript paper. Oh, manuscript paper? Universal, expressed in language. That white piece of paper, white, universal, expressed in language. We can go down and talk about as many qualities or as many predicates as we want. They're always going to be expressed in language. They're always going to be universals, and so they're always not getting there to the thing itself that's supposed to be more real, supposed to have absolute certainty and truth. So he says, they certainly mean this bit of paper, which is different from the other bit above, but they say things like actual things, or sensuous objects, or absolutely singular entities. And when they do that, here's where it gets interesting. Words like this are words, aren't they? They're universals. Every single thing is a single thing, right? They all have singularity in common. We can say they have unity. At least the medievals would say, well, they have unity in common, you know? But if we want to try to emphasize how different they are from everything else, even the property of being completely different than everything else is a property and falls on the side of this, which means that all of this stuff is actually subsumed in here. This is actually abstract. It's not concrete. To talk about some purely, beyond any sort of language experience, you do that in language. So Hegel is pointing out a problematic inherent in any of this sort of thing. We're already in the realm of consciousness. We're already in the realm of language and the universal. So he goes on and he says, what is called the unutterable is nothing else than the untrue, the irrational, what is merely meant but not expressed. So if you can express it, if you're going to talk about the unimaginable or the unutterable or the impossible to include within the realm of our consciousness, you got one of two choices. It's a dilemma. Either you're actually talking about something that you can frame within language, and then it does have some sort of, utterability or conceivability or imaginability because you're already doing it, or it's like totally beyond the pale and you're just standing there and spouting nonsense. So this is a real dividing point here. He says, if nothing more is said of something than that it is an actual thing or an external object, that's the most abstract of generalities. You're not actually saying anything there. You may intend to be saying something, you may feel like you're saying something, but it doesn't have any real cognitive content. What actually does have cognitive content? Well, when you look at this paper and you, the I, is perceiving it, and you, the I, is pointing it out, and you, the I, is talking about it, you are treating that paper as a this, or as a here. And what have we observed about the this and the here? They're actually universals. So what this means, according to Hegel, is that when you're grasping some sensuous particular as what it is, when you're grasping the truth, when you are grasping the truth of that sensuous particular, you're doing it through the universal. Interestingly enough, what does it mean to grasp the truth of the universal, or the particular in the universal? In German, there's a play on words, and that's what he's going to conclude with here in this passage. Hegel really does like to play with language whenever he can. People, often, this is a total digression, but people often criticize, Heidegger or Derrida or Lacan for, making all sorts of puns and plays on words. This guy does it all the time. It's just, oftentimes people don't catch it quite as much. Anyway. True. Wahrheit is truth. So Wahrnehmung is perception. Wahrnehmen, that's the verb for to take or to grasp. So if you're grasping the Wahrheit, the truth of the sensuous particular through the universal, you are engaging in Wahrnehmung. You are, the verb would be wahrnehmen, right? Ich nehme wahr. Yeah. So, what this means is that you're actually perceiving the sensuous particular. And what it means to perceive is to have the universal under which we can actually bring it. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a pure quality of just sort of naming or abstraction or anything else. We're going to see that as we move into this next section. Keep in mind that all these dialectical advances that we've had, so seeing the here, for example, as being a multiplicity of heres, as being a universal in itself, as having mediation, as having negativity, we want to hold on to all of that as we go into that.